One October morning in 2018, journalist William Geroux says he was returning some books to his local Virginia Beach library when he noticed a new state historical marker planted in the ground near the front entrance. It said the library was built on the site of a World War II prisoner of war camp. In Mr. Giroux's author's note in his latest book called The 15, he writes, quote, "I was surprised and a little embarrassed," unquote, not to know that the U.S. had 700 POW camps spread throughout the United States in 46 different states, housing 371,683 German soldiers and 49,784 Italians. That's during World War II. His book is subtitled Murder, Retribution, and the Forgotten Story of Nazi POWs in America. William Geroux, where did you get the title The 15?
Well, I just because there are 15 German POWs that got sentenced to death for these for the killings that the book is about, and 15 Americans in German custody that were rounded up at that point to be exchanged, supposedly. So that was it was really it was no more complicated than that. I guess you could ask, which 15 are you referring to, the Germans or the Americans? But it could be either, really.
Go back to that day in 2018. You're at your library in Virginia Beach. You saw that plaque. What happened after that?
As you say, I had never heard of German POW camps in the United States before, which was surprised me because I've read a lot about World War II. I've written a couple of books about it, but I went to the library one day and saw somebody had planted a historical marker saying that there'd been a big German POW camp at the library, which is only a couple of miles from my house. And I thought, how did I not know this? So I went in the library. I looked for some books on it. There weren't any. I drove around the area that the camp had been on. No trace of it. Asked a couple of guys there. Nobody had heard of it. And so I went back and plunged into the internet rabbit hole. And there was so much information about the old camps, I couldn't believe it. But
how long ago did you actually start the book?
Probably sometime in, I guess, late 2018, I started researching. I was really researching it to see what sort of, whether there might be a book there. I thought, if I've never heard of these camps, probably there are a lot of people that haven't heard of them either. And I thought, I wonder if there's a good story in there. So I started just looking into it, and I just kept finding more and more surprising stuff in there. And I don't know at which point I decided it was going to be a book, but it was probably 6 months after that.
How many of those camps did you go to?
I went to probably 6 of the ones, particularly the ones where the killings had taken place. There's some of the camps you can go to without knowing you've been to them. There's really not much left of most of them. There's a few historical markers, maybe a half dozen have been turned into, sort of low octane tourist traps, or just tourist, attractions. I've been to a couple of them, and they're quite nice. Really, they're very interesting if you're interested in this sort of thing. But so yeah, I went to probably a half dozen.
What was your first camp?
The first one was Camp Concordia. And that was the first one. It was it's in north central Kansas, which is a very remote place, even by standards of Kansas. And I just started reading about what had gone on there. There had been a couple of forced suicides there, and there was a lot of really interesting material from Camp Concordia. So I contacted somebody out there that I found online, and he said, come on out. So I flew out there, and he presented me with all sorts of documentation. I think I mentioned in the book that he gave me enough background information that I couldn't even fit it all in my suitcases on the way home. So there are a lot of sort of amateur historians that have latched on to these old POW camps, and they've some of them have just done a fascinating job. It's a good thing because they've preserved a lot of the they've done oral histories. They preserved a lot of interviews with former guards and townspeople and even prisoners who are no longer alive today. So it would have, without those, it would have been very difficult to reconstruct what happened in the camps, because there's a lot of official documents, but they only go so far in telling a story.
What is a forced suicide? And you say there were two of them at Camp Concordia?
Yes. These were cases, and one, the evidence was a little stronger than the other, but they were cases where German POWs had been judged by the sort of the hidden Nazi hierarchy in these camps to have either lost faith in the Third Reich or in Hitler, or were, kind of working against them. So they would the forced suicides were situations where the Nazis, after dark, after the Americans had left the German portions of the POW camp for the night, they would have secret courts. They called them honor courts, and they would bring prisoners before the courts to because they had supposedly done things or said things or been observed to behave in a certain way. And in this case, the first guy had sort of lost faith in Hitler, but he wasn't out proselytizing his fellow prisoners to do that. He was kept it to himself. But the Nazis stole his diary and found an entry where he had said that he thought Nazism would be the ruin of Germany, which of course it was. And on that basis, they called him before an honor court and said, "You either commit suicide." They handed him a clothesline and a chair, said, "Go into your quarters and hang yourself. If you don't," according to the informants, they threatened him. They said that we will get word back to Germany for the Gestapo to murder your wife in your place. So the POW paced and thought about it for a while and finally hanged himself. The second case was similar than that. It was similar. It was an Austrian soldier who was determined by the local Nazis in his camp to have lost faith in Hitler, and he was threatened and ultimately slit his own wrists. So these were these were two forced suicides that the Army acknowledged that this had happened, but there were dozens of other suicides in the camps around the United States, and some of those almost surely were murders that the guards were not trained to recognize or to investigate. So that's what a forced suicide meant.
Who made the decision to set up POW camps for the Germans in this country, and when did they do it?
We started thinking about it in 1942 because when we realized that once we got into the war, there were going to be some prisoners. But we started out, Roosevelt and his staff said that we would only take 50,000 of these guys. We were concerned in having too many POWs here in the United States. We'd never done it before. And we really didn't have any experience doing it. And we didn't really want to start out with large numbers of hardcore Nazis. But so we said, we'll take 50,000. But we felt that any more than that, we'd have mass escapes. The POWs would be raping and pillaging and sabotaging their way across the country. But very shortly thereafter, just the reality of it, there were so many prisoners, particularly when the Africa Corps was defeated in North Africa in May of 1943. We suddenly found ourselves with 120,000 German prisoners coming to the United States. And there was simply nowhere else to put them. Britain, this tiny island nation, was already holding 500,000. Canada took maybe 36,000, but that was about all they could handle. And nobody really had the manpower, the food, or the space to keep these guys, except the United States. And we had plenty of all three of those things. So just by necessity, really, we accepted more and more, another 50,000, another 40,000. We ended up, as I said, taking 120,000 men from the Africa Corps. And then after that, they just kept pouring, the prisoners just kept pouring in. And by the end of the war, we had almost 400,000 German POWs in the United States. We had 371, I believe.
You say that at one point, Winston Churchill was coming to the United States to meet with FDR on the Queen Mary, and he didn't know there were German POWs below?
No, he didn't. When he started the voyage, or I don't know at what point he discovered it, but at some point in the voyage, he discovered he was going to be sharing the ship with some German POWs. The reason for that is there were so many POWs, we were just cramming them like sardines into any returning merchant ship or any kind of ship that we had going from North Africa to the United States. And one of those ships was the Queen Mary. So we were just desperate to find some way to get these prisoners over here as quickly as possible, because every minute they stayed in North Africa meant that they had to be fed there, they had to be guarded there. The troops that we had over there, we wanted them to be fighting, not guarding these guys. But if we brought them back to the United States, we had soldiers who normally would not be fighting who could do the guarding. So that's why we wanted to get them over here, because the longer we kept them over there, the more they were going to occupy our troops who we felt had better things to do than watch prisoners.
How many different camps were there in this country?
There were over 650, and I'm a little vague with that because the Army did not keep very good track of how many camps. They have a listing that I found in the National Archives, but after looking at it and looking at the numbers there, I've just in my other research, just wandering around, I've found a number of camps that are not on their list. Now, of those 650, about 150 were large, they called them main camps with space for, maybe 4,000 to 6,000 POWs. The rest of the camps were smaller branch camps, and these were camps like that where they were established outside the main camps to be close to the workstations, the places where the POWs worked. We could compel them to work, and we did. So we set up a whole system of camps, sort of satellite camps around each main camp to bring workers closer to their workplaces, the farms, the factories, or wherever they were working. So that was the total. About 650, of which 150 were the big camps, like Camp Concordia.
More than once you mentioned the Geneva Convention. What was it, and what impact did that have on how these POWs were treated in this country?
The Geneva Convention, the one that was used in World War II, had been written in 1929, and it was basically rules for the conduct of warfare, and including the treatment of prisoners. So it laid out all these requirements that a warring nation that signed on to the Geneva Convention had to abide by, or was supposed to abide by. And the Geneva Convention, in the rules were, some people in the United States considered to be the requirements to be a bit much. The requirements basically said that for example, a German POW in the United States had to have essentially the same living quarters as an American soldier based on the home front. So that translated to comfortable beds, plenty of good or reasonably good food, all sorts of activities they could engage in, arts and crafts. They could play soccer. They could, some of these guys would put on plays. They would make sculptures. They would paint landscapes. There's all of these camps. There are surrounding them. There are in little shops. There are landscapes, not all of them, but many of them painted by the German POWs of the landscapes they saw on the edges of the camps or out on their work details. So we decided we wanted to follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. Some other countries were following it, but we're not strict about it, including the countries that we were fighting. But we wanted to do it to the letter because at the time, this was the leaders from FDR on down thought that this was the American way. It was just the right thing to do, was to treat your enemies humanely, to treat them well. But they also thought that if we treated our enemy prisoners well, that the enemy was more likely to treat our prisoners well. And in World War II, humane treatment of POWs was far from a given. And the Germans in particular, they treated our POWs and the British and the Canadians, the Western countries they were fighting, at the beginning of the war at least, tried to honor the Geneva Convention, not quite to the extent that we did, but they tried to do it. But on the Eastern Front, where the Germans were fighting the Russians, it was nothing like it. The Russians and the Germans routinely murdered or enslaved each other's prisoners. So it was we very much wanted to follow the Geneva Convention so we could get Hitler to follow it. But we always wondered, what is going to happen? Okay, he seems to be following it so far, at least with regard to Americans. But what is he going to do when inevitably his back gets up against the wall? How's he going to treat them then? And by then by the end of the war, we had more than 80,000 Americans in German hands. So there was a lot at stake.
Who was Luis Biagioni?
He was a spy. He was one of the 15 Americans who was basically sentenced to death and offered in trade for the Germans that we had convicted of murders here in the United States. He was an extremely courageous 21-year-old Italian American who had volunteered to parachute into Nazi-occupied Italy in the dark of the moon and set up an observation post, basically with a radio for the OSS, the Office of Special Services, which was really a forerunner of the CIA. And so Luis Biagioni parachuted into Italy, was supposed to have his radio with him. That was supposed to be airdropped in separately, but they never found it. So he spent much of the time wandering around trying to find a radio so that he could communicate with the OSS, and finally was captured by the Gestapo and imprisoned in an SS-run labor and death camp in Mauthausen, and was so his life was at risk. He was one of the men they were trying to, the Americans that we were trying to get back in exchange for the German that we had incarcerated at Fort Leavenworth after the murders.
I want to read what you quote him as saying or writing right at the beginning of chapter 19 to give us a flavor of what went on, at least on the German side. Biagioni wrote, "They were required to take several cold showers and stand naked in the cold open air during the course of the day and night. In the morning, when I observed them, there were about 50 left. A guard beat the survivors to the ground with a bat, and a second guard crushed their heads with a hammer. Other prisoners were ordered to carry the bodies to the crematorium. Biagioni noticed that the Jews in the camp, who previously had mingled with the other prisoners, were being segregated into some kind of tent village in a gully north of the barracks. He later realized, you say, they were not being relocated but executed and then burned in the crematorium. What's the circumstances around that quote and your reporting?
That quote is from one of Biagioni's reports to the OSS, and he talks about his experience at Mauthausen, which was really was, as I've had not heard of Mauthausen before writing the book, and I've read since a great deal about it, and it's as horrible a place as any of the death camps that you read about. And Biagioni was kept there basically to be exchanged. It was a place basically where the Germans would bring prisoners and work them on short rations until they collapsed. They had a giant mine in the middle of the place, and they were hauling stones out of the mines, and it was just a tremendously cruel place that just became worse and worse as the war went on. And it started out as a forced labor camp, but soon was clearly just a death camp where they sent people to kill them. And Biagioni, because of who he was, because of his situation, because the Germans were trying to trade him, was basically kept from serious harm there, but was in a position to watch countless others die and be beaten. One of his best friends was at a different camp, was informed that he was going to be transferred to a new camp, and he was taken out with a bunch of other people, and instead of being transferred, they took them out into a field and shot them. So Mauthausen was just a place of unimaginable cruelty, and Biagioni, because of his position there, could observe most of it and report back to what happened.
What other camp did you? I know you said about 6. We got Camp Concordia. What's next?
Camp Tonkawa in rural Oklahoma was the scene of the first confirmed murder of the Nazis by another prisoner. This prisoner was accused and apparently did try to write a letter to the Americans offering them information, including some suggestions for bombing Hamburg, the city of Hamburg, which had already been devastated by bombing. And this guy had written a letter and described different camouflage that was going on in Hamburg and how this could be overcome. And so the letter fell into the hands of the leader of the Nazi faction at the camp, and they called an honor court that night and to expose him as a traitor. And things, depending on who you talk to, things were either planned or got out of hand, and he ended up just being brutally beaten to death by a mob. And that was the first murder that was not, where the Nazis didn't try to make it look like a suicide. And that was brought Leon Jaworski as a prosecutor he was assigned to try to get to the bottom of this, because it was prosecuting a mob, a murder by mob is not as easy as it sounds. You can't say a bunch of people got together and killed this guy. You have to attach individual acts to individual people. And all the Nazis, all the POWs were reluctant to tell anybody what had happened, certainly to tell the guards. So it took a skilled interrogator to get to the bottom of it, and Leon Jaworski was that.
If you're, I don't know what the year would be, under 50, you may never have heard the name Leon Jaworski. Who was he?
Leon Jaworski I've encountered this a little bit. I'm of a certain age that I know who he was, and you are too, I'm sure. But Leon Jaworski, I had never heard of him until the 70s, when he was involved in the Watergate case. He was brought in as a special prosecutor by Richard Nixon, who had fired the previous special prosecutor. And I think Nixon may have brought him in thinking that, Jaworski would sympathize with him, but Jaworski doggedly went after the White House audio tapes that ultimately first forced Richard Nixon to resign from the White House. So he was also on the Warren Commission. So he became very well known. He was a centrist Democrat from Texas, but he had knew people well in both parties and crossed the aisle a lot. And he was just but in the 1940s he was an ambitious defense attorney and was really in Texas was a real rising star. Corporate lawyer making lots of money, and he astonished everybody that knew him in 1943 by announcing that he had decided to join the Army. And he was a little old to be joining the Army. He was in no danger of being drafted, but he said he felt like he had to do his part. And he figured he would be he figured he'd be on the home front, he'd be on the periphery of the war, but he didn't realize that he would soon be confronting Nazis in places like Kansas and Arkansas, or Oklahoma and Arkansas.
So if you take these camps, how many were there nationwide?
650.
Who ran them?
The Army, the U.S. Army, the Provost Marshal General's office. And they were a relatively new branch of the Army that was formed, and they were given responsibility not only for running the camps, but for staffing them with guards, which was very difficult, and also for making sure that the prisoners did not get out and sabotage any of the targets in the immediate area, which would be, defense plants or anything like that in the area immediately surrounding the camp. So they ran it under the War Department.
What was the ratio of the 650 that were in the South?
The majority were in the South. I don't know the exact ratio, but we set out, the Army set out to locate them all in the South. They thought there are not going to be that many of these initially, and we thought if we build them in the South, the land is cheap, the labor is cheap, we don't have to insulate these buildings to such an extent. So if you look at there's a map of the camps in the books, and you can see that most of them are Texas, I think, had the most of them, but most are in the South and the Southwest. But as the Army got building them, they realized that they're even in the South and Southwest, there wasn't quite enough space for all of these camps. So the camps are literally all over the United States. And by 1944 or so, they were putting the camps up, not originally they put them in places where national security was their main concern. They didn't want to put them near any big cities, any defense plants, any navigable waterways. But after about a year, when it was clear that these mass escapes were not going to be a problem, the camps were literally located in places that needed the most labor because the Germans provided it. They were this incredible source of labor that was desperately needed in the United States at the time. So they were basically business people and chambers of commerce and politicians would apply for a camp in a particular area. They say, look, we've got a factory, an alfalfa drying factory that, we don't have anybody to work there. We've got farms, nobody will work there. And the Army would consider it. And if they had enough POWs, they'd say, okay, we'll open a camp there if they could find it. And they would try to put it on federal property that was being unused, but they ran out of that pretty quickly. So they began just buying it from landowners.
How many of these camps were built from the ground up?
Most of them, I'd say probably in excess of 600.
What did they look like?
They looked like if you've seen a penitentiary, they look kind of like that. They were inside. They were clusters of these very hastily, crudely built single-story wooden barracks along with support buildings, and these were surrounded by 2 9-foot tall barbed wire fences, and the fences were interspersed with guard towers. And the guards had machine guns and rifles and searchlights. And of course, the guard towers were occupied 24 hours a day. And they really looked a lot like most of them were somewhat secluded. So they weren't things that you would encounter just in your, on your commute to work or anything like that. Most of them were tucked into little corners, even the ones that were not really, really remote. But so most people that lived in the United States, if they had a camp in their area, they were aware of that camp. They may have had dealings with the prisoners, but most people in the United States had no idea of the sheer number of these camps or the sheer number of prisoners that we had, German prisoners that we had in the United States. And that was kind of the way the Army liked it, because they didn't want really people to be thinking, holy cow, we've got all these Germans here. They were bringing them in. It wasn't a secret exactly, but it wasn't something they advertised either.
What was the biggest escape that any of the Germans attempted?
The biggest escape was in December 1944, right around the time of the Battle of the Bulge. A group of German Navy guys, U-boat commanders and U-boat crewmen, that were all based down in Camp Papago Park in Arizona, which is just east of Phoenix. You could even see the Phoenix skyline from the camp, but it was a little desert camp. And these guys in December 44 built a very long tunnel. It's like 178 feet through the rock and the sand, and 26 of them, I believe, crawled out of that camp one by one, and before they were discovered. And they made a run for Mexico. And none of them got there. It was very difficult to get away from Stalag America, but it was impressive that it's such a large escape. And the Phoenix Gazette, I've got some pictures of it. They ran the mug shots of all the Germans, splattered across the front page, reminding people there was a reward for the capture of each of these guys. But they were all captured. Most of them were captured within a day, and the vast majority within 2 or 3 days, because it was very difficult. They were unfamiliar with it. They're out there in the desert trying to find their way, and the weather is weird. It's raining, and it's just so most of them finally just were captured. And the last guy who was at large was a U-boat commander, and he finally gave up and walked into Phoenix one day and just had himself some breakfast, struck up a conversation with some sanitation workers, and gave himself away, and off he went. He was back in the POW camp. But the camp, some books have been written on this escape, and it was really quite inventive. But as I point out in the book, it really mainly just showed the futility of trying to escape from Stalag America. It was just nearly impossible. You could, if you're a prisoner in Europe, you could, and you get away from a POW camp, you might have a puncher's chance of falling in with a resistance group, or making your way across to a border to like Sweden or Switzerland. But if you're in the middle of the United States, if you're in Concordia, Kansas, you're hundreds, if not thousands of miles from the nearest, just from the ocean or from the border of Canada or Mexico, both of which were at war with Nazi Germany. And so if it was easy enough to get out from behind the barbed wire, or out on a work detail to just walk away. But what do you do then? You're just a hunted person from the get-go. You've got farmers with shotguns. You've got the county sheriff, the state police, the FBI, some Native American trackers even helped try to find the guys that got away from Papago Park in Arizona. And you had to run, travel at night, hide during the day. and really not even the most resourceful POW could think of all the ways that you could possibly give yourself away. And I have one example in the court where a very resourceful POW, a Luftwaffe pilot, walked away from a camp in Canada. He stole a boat, rode to Detroit, got on trains and buses. He made it all the way to San Antonio. He was going to make it a run for Mexico. And he gave himself away because one morning at a diner, he could not figure out how much money to give the waitress. And that brought attention to him, and he was picked up. Some others were weirdly were caught up in the workings of the Jim Crow system. A couple of POWs were captured after they sat in the back of a bus under signs for black people only that the POWs could not read. So it was there were all sorts of ways that you could give yourself away, and I think there was only one German POW that escaped from the United States and actually made it back to Germany to continue the fight. One.
How many people did the Americans execute because of a crime that these POWs committed while they were imprisoned?
We condemned 15 of them to die, and we ended up executing 14. Truman, who was in the middle of the process of deciding what to do with these men, FDR died, and Truman took over as president, and his advisors persuaded him to commute the sentence of one of the Germans who had been convicted of murder on the ground that there was the evidence was too circumstantial to support a murder conviction. So we ended up hanging 14 of the 15 Germans that we condemned, and we hanged them in 3 groups. We didn't hang them like in all at once. We'd hang them one after another, but we hanged the first 5, and then the next 2, and then the final 7 were hanged, really one right after the other at Fort Leavenworth in a makeshift gallows in an elevator shaft, and they were hanged again one right after the other in a process that took less than 3 hours.
What year?
This would have been 1945, and it was a time when the war. We elected to hang them right after Germany surrendered, but Japan was still fighting, so we were the hangings of these Germans, which under different circumstances may have generated interest in the American public, were pretty much lost in the day that I believe the 7 last U-boat men from Camp Papago Park were hanged. We were getting ready to occupy Japan, and our ships were entering Tokyo Bay, and there were reports that Japanese civilians had been committing suicide en masse in front of the Imperial Palace. So there was a lot of, we had just dropped the atomic bomb, so there was a lot going on in the world, and these hangings, which under different circumstances might have attracted attention, ended up being just buried. I think they ran like page 12 and 15 in the New York Times under a little story under the headline, "Nazis hanged for murder at Fort Leavenworth."
What's your own background? When did you start into the journalism business?
I was a newspaper reporter for close to 30 years.
Where?
I started out in a little daily in Yorktown, Virginia. Went to work, went out west, and just my wilderness period. Went to work at a little daily paper in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is on the Idaho Panhandle. It's gotten to be a very unusual place, but when I was there, it was a little less crazy. From there, I came back to Virginia and worked in the daily press in Newport News for a while. But I spent most of my journalism career working for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, in Richmond, Virginia. And the whole time I worked for them, I was working in bureaus. I was like a one-person bureau, first of all in Petersburg and then in Norfolk. And it was in Norfolk where I did a lot of coverage of the military, and I got used to dealing with the military and got sort of an interest in it, more of an interest, even more than I'd had growing up. So that's my.
You write a lot about American POWs over in Germany and held over in Europe, and there's some characters, to say the least. I want to ask you about King Kong William Schaefer. Who was he? And his sidekick Jimmy Schmitz.
Right. William Schaefer was a big, imposing lieutenant commander in the Army. He was just a very tough guy who didn't really suffer fools or anyone else gladly, and his men liked him. I mean, he was a good leader, but always behind his back, they called him King Kong because he was just an absolutely tough character. And one of the things he always told his men is, do not get captured. You won't do us any good if you get captured. And of course, during the invasion of Sicily, he was captured. So he ended up being hauled through Italy and by the Germans, and then taken to Germany, and just treated very roughly by the Germans. But he never gave up. And as a prisoner, he was unusual. A lot of the prisoners, including Jimmy Schmitz, who was a prisoner with him, took the attitude that, America is going to win this war with or without any further help from me. So while I'm in this camp, I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm going to follow the rules. I'm not going to do anything wrong, and I'll get back home. But William Schaefer, King Kong, did not believe that. He felt that it is his duty as a prisoner every day to make life as difficult as he could for his German captors. And he just would never pass up an opportunity to argue with them. He carried a dog-eared copy of the Geneva Convention around in his pocket, and if they gave an order he didn't like, he'd pull it out and argue with them. And he just enjoyed it. And one of his fellow POWs reported that one of the things he particularly liked to do when a guard or a German officer particularly enraged him is he had a full set of false teeth, and he would take them out, sort of aim the business end at whoever was bothering him, and just clack them really fast, and just to annoy these guys. So he was somebody that was always in the Germans' business. And he said, I think they all hated me. And he was right, because they wasted no opportunity to punish him, to starve him, to imprison him. He was imprisoned for a while in Colditz Castle, which is a well-known Renaissance era prison in Germany, where a lot of what they called incorrigible Allied prisoners were taken. So that was one of his stops. And he and Schmitz, James Schmitz, Lieutenant Schmitz, who served with him, were both condemned to death by the Germans over a relatively minor incident. They'd been King Kong always liked to, as I mentioned, always liked to fight it out with the Germans, whatever they did. But one day, a couple of German sergeants came by the camp to put up a poster. And it was just a kind of a crude propaganda poster. And Schmitz and Schaefer didn't like it. And they knew they couldn't do anything about it, but they briefly stood in the path of these German sergeants and just said, "We object to this." And as soon as the Germans tried to get past them, they sprang aside and let the Germans put the posters up. But for that single symbolic act of defiance, they were sentenced to death in Germany and put up for trade with some of the Germans that were incarcerated at Fort Leavenworth.
How many, by the way, Americans were executed by the Germans? Did you study that at all?
Yeah, none of these 15 were executed. and they none of the others were either. They were this was the execution of that the Germans were threatening to execute the Americans for was purely a response to the imprisonment of the 15 Germans at Fort Leavenworth for murder. It was purely that. That was the only reason they did it. The only reason they sentenced those guys to death. They rounded them up, and in the space of like 2 days, sentenced 15 of them to death, more than 15.
What about the story of the 76 Stalag Luft number 3, 336-foot tunnel? Hitler ordered all 76 shot. What's the background on that one?
That is what is known popularly as the Great Escape, and it took place from an officer's prison in Germany, and they escaped in 75 or 76 Americans escaped, and they were quickly recaptured. This was the movie, that has Steve McQueen and everything. And in fact, with apologies to Steve McQueen, there were no Americans involved in the Great Escape, although some of them had helped plan the Great Escape earlier, before it came off, before they were transferred. But the Great Escape was, it's a popular movie. It's a heroic tale, but at the end of it, all but 3 of the 76 escapees were recaptured. 3 of them made it on ships and made it across to Sweden, but the rest were recaptured. And Hitler was so furious, even though that none of them had sabotaged anything, none of them had done any great damage, but the escape kept the Germans occupied for they had thousands of men that they had to pull off other details, and it was just Hitler was just furious. So after they were recaptured, he ordered them all shot, just shot summarily, which was, escape was not illegal. There was no prisoners under the Geneva Convention were allowed to escape if they could. So there was really nothing wrong with conducting the Great Escape. But Hitler was so furious, he ordered them shot. And his advisors persuaded him that, you can't just do that. That'll come back to haunt us. So he finally he backed off, but he said only to the point where he said we want to shoot half of them, which is just. And so they ended up shooting. I think he turned it over to Himmler, who decided to shoot 50. So these 50 of these escaped. Most of them were basically Allied aviators. Most of them British, but from a number of other countries as well. And in a lot of cases, they were taken out in trucks, told they were moving from one camp to the next, and about midway there, they told them to get out and stretch their legs. And when they did, they machine gunned them and shot them. And a couple of managed to get away and tell the tale, but that became known as the Great Escape. And it was for the American POWs in Germany. It was the word got back, and it was very chilling because it meant to them that if you escape, no matter what the Geneva Convention says, if you escape, you're liable to get shot and killed.
You have a excerpt from a letter from a German prisoner. I want to read this excerpt because it does send a message to Americans if they've never heard this. He said, growing up under the Nazis, we were brainwashed. We considered it perfectly all right to sacrifice ourselves, even our lives, for the fatherland. I began to change my attitude toward Hitler and National Socialism when I met the common American people. They were friendly and open and didn't hesitate to express themselves. They were not filled with hatred toward us. In Nazi Germany, we would never have been allowed to talk and act the way Americans did. Our parents couldn't educate us in the right way because it was too dangerous for them. So what I saw in American civilian society made me think about German society and what I wanted to do with my life. What led to your decision to put that in the book?
I thought it was a classic response by a German POW who was not an ardent Nazi to seeing America, and it was what we wanted when we, what we hoped when we brought them over here. Part of the idea was that they would see there was a different way. Most of these German POWs had been, not only had they been fighting the war for years, but they'd been brought up under the Hitler Youth. So they had been so filled with propaganda and lies all their lives that they had no real clear understanding of what was going on in the world. At the beginning of when they first came over here and they were arriving on the ships in New York Harbor and other places, they were amazed that for example, the New York skyline was not smoldering. It's sort of they expected sort of a post 9/11 thing where you'd have, some of the buildings would be missing, others would be askew, because they were under the impression that the Luftwaffe had been bombing the United States. That's how crazy some of them were, and it seemed crazy to the Americans who talked to them. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, interviewed them and was just amazed at all the nonsense they believed. And so when they came over here and saw America, they saw a country that was nothing like they had been described to them. It was big, it was rich. Some of them were on trains, to get to these, when they brought them over by ship to the East Coast ports, and they put them on trains to go to, sometimes these train rides, if they were going to Arizona or Kansas or, Utah, it would take a week, with very, very few stops. And they just were amazed at how big America was. And the Nazis would say, they're tricking you. They're driving the trains around in circles, so you will think there's more. America's bigger than it is. But that got harder and harder to believe, and partly because the trains themselves were these old surplus Pullman coaches, and they were comfortable, and they had food service and a bathroom at the end, and in the Germans in the German army in Europe had always traveled in boxcars. So they just got a real different view of America. And some of them felt just as the letter writer did, and many of them did. And there are a lot of letters, and there are some others in the book too, where they're amazed by how well they're treated. They're amazed by the food. One guy wrote, he said, "Hey, I'm getting fat here. We haven't eaten like this in years." And so they're really getting a different impression from the United States, not in the camps, but once they go out in the work details. They go to a farm, and the farmer, they're very friendly at the farm. They're I quote a teenage farm boy in there is saying, I kept reminding myself that the Germans were our enemies, but here they are, they're helping to save our family farm. And you work with somebody every day and you become friends with them. And the farm wives, particularly in the Midwest, in the German American communities, where the prisoners were welcomed like long lost relatives, really. And some of the families actually did have relatives who were POWs, but they were at the end of the day, of a day at the farm, the farm wives would insist that the prisoners and the guards come sit around the family table and have dinner with them and eat fried chicken, which was a gross violation of Army regulations. But I mean, you're in north central Kansas, so the farm wives are in charge there, I think.
So I know you spent a lot of time with people that do know this story, but when you got away from people that follow the story, how often did you run into Americans that had ever heard of this?
Since I've been out, on a book tour and giving events, there's always somebody there that knows about the Germans. They said, "Oh yeah, they used to come over by the plant and did some work for us." And so they were, and of course, there are people that are older, or people that whose parents told them about them. But I've found a lot more people that know about it. But they're people that really hadn't thought about it in a long time, or it was just something they knew, and that the Germans had come here and had worked around here, because that was the contact they had. They could all enlisted men could be compelled to work. So they worked on farms, they worked in factories, they worked everywhere. So a lot of these people just came in contact with these guys, and at the time, labor was in really short supply in the United States, because millions of Americans had gone overseas to either gone overseas to fight, or they'd gone to work at the defense plants, which paid better than farm work. So a lot of people have not only memories of these Germans, but very fond memories of Germans as people whose hard work saved their business or kept it afloat at a time when it was struggling.
What's the story of Colonel Henry Spicer?
Colonel Henry Spicer was one of the 15 Americans that was ultimately rounded up and sentenced to death. And Spicer was a hotshot P-51 Mustang pilot, and he was cocky, and he was not to say arrogant, but he felt very highly of his own abilities, and he also developed just a bitter hatred for the Germans, and I mean that went beyond what a lot of the soldiers felt. And he had like I say, he was cocky. He was so cocky and such a risk taker that Chuck Yeager, the personification of the right stuff, who was at one point was Spicer's wingman, complained that Spicer took too many chances. But Spicer was shot down over the coast of France when he apparently dropped too low so he could light his pipe on the way back from a bombing mission. He was shot down into the English Channel, was basically rescued by the Germans on the beach after several days in the cold, and sent to a POW camp in northern Germany. And while he was there, he hated the Germans. Every contact he had with them, he hated everything about them. And on one day, he had a British paratrooper that had just been captured and had told Spicer all these stories about atrocities the Germans had committed. So one day, Spicer, in the course of a speech that was supposed to be about something else, got up in front of the men under the POWs under his command. There were about 1,400 of them. Got up and gave a speech in which he basically, the theme of the speech was, the Germans they're not your friends. You know, they come around pretending to be your friends. They're not your friends. They're trying to win this war. They're war criminals. You've got to resist them. And he said, he closed it by saying, I personally would be happy to spend the next 10 years in this hole, meaning the POW camp, if during that time the entire German army was wiped off the face of the earth. And those were almost his exact words. And for those words, he was sentenced to death for that speech. I forget what the exact charges against him were, but it was just the Germans just thought he was a troublemaker, as they did with Schaefer, King Kong Schaefer. They thought he was a troublemaker and saw an opportunity to sentence him to death. So that's what they did. So he was sentenced to death for making a speech.
Did he die?
No, none of the Americans, none of the 15 Americans, they all were offered by the Germans in trade, but some negotiations. At first, we didn't want to negotiate. We thought, this is ridiculous. We're not trading a bunch of convicted killers for these Americans who basically haven't hurt anybody, didn't do anything. But but we finally agreed. The State Department intervened and said, to the War Department and said, if you think about how this is going to look, if we get to the end of the war and these 15 Americans get executed and it comes out publicly that we had a chance to save them and we didn't. So finally, we started negotiating with the Germans about how we were going to exchange these guys. And we worked out a plan, or the beginnings of a plan, where they'd be exchanged in two large parts on the different points along the Swiss border. But while the negotiations were going on, the Allied armies and the Russians were overrunning Germany. This was in the spring of 1945. So they were overrunning the camps where some of the Americans, including Spicer and King Kong Schaefer, were being held, and they were freeing them. So the negotiations sort of, at the same time, the German communications system was collapsing. So the negotiations pretty much collapsed, not only because some of the prisoners were no longer prisoners, but because the Germany was just falling apart too quickly. So all 15 of these men ended up being freed. Although for them, being freed was kind of a dangerous thing too, because you were being freed from a POW camp into really the violent chaos of a collapsing Germany. So some of them almost lost their lives they were in greater danger really after being freed than they were when they were being held by the Germans.
FDR died on April the 12th, 1945. Hitler shot himself to death on the 30th of April. How quickly after that did all the German POWs get back to Germany?
Well, a lot of the German POWs wanted to stay in the United States, but we told them nobody can stay. Everyone has to go back, but if you want to come back, you can, apply for citizenship, go through that whole process. So it was going to be a long process getting them back there. But immediately after Germany surrendered in May of 45, we immediately switched all our energies, or most of them, to fighting the Japanese, who were still fighting. So we basically told the German POWs, you're not going anywhere right away, just because we don't have the bandwidth to mobilize and get you back there. So for months, we were so occupied with the Japanese that we didn't address that. And the Germans stayed here and they continued to work. And some of the employers here, some of the farmers wanted them to stay here because the Americans weren't back yet. But they, I'm sorry, where were they?
We're just talking about how quickly they returned to Germany.
Oh, so after a little less than a year, we started getting into the process of, okay, we've got to get these guys back there. And there were the Army was faced with the question of which ones to send back first. And the first idea they had, I don't know where they got this, was let's send the real hardcore Nazis back because they're useless anyway over here. They're not working, they're not helping. But then people said, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't reward these guys for being obdurate Nazis. You've got to. So we finally ended up sending back coal miners and engineers and picking out people that we thought would might help rebuild Germany. But we sent them all back a lot of them got back by 1946, most of them. But there were hundreds of thousands of them that we didn't turn over directly. We didn't send right home. We sent them to the British and the French. And in some cases, the British and French kept them working for months, a year afterwards, repairing the damage that the Third Reich had done in Europe. So there were a number of the Germans felt betrayed by that because they had been here in the United States. They thought they'd been treated well. And then when the war was over, they thought they were going to go back to Germany. But they, in many cases, they were not. In many cases, their experience working was only beginning. We also had a problem with sending back POWs who were from nations that had been overrun by the Soviets. because these POWs, they'd served in the German army. So if you'd served in the German army under, no matter what the circumstances, you did not want to face the prospect of being sent back essentially to the Soviet Union, where you'd be at the mercy of Stalin, who was a good bet to either kill you or throw you in the gulag. So we had thousands of POWs that we were holding we were looking at sending back to Poland and some of these other, the Baltic states. And the prisoners really didn't want to go. They knew what was going to happen to them. And in a couple of instances, prisoners rioted and committed suicide and begged the guards to shoot them rather than send them back to the Soviet Union. And we considered briefly offering these people asylum in the United States, because it really was a situation where if they went back there, there was a good chance that they would either be killed or imprisoned. But we finally decided that with all the tension that was going on in Europe anyway, that offering asylum to these former POWs would just make things worse. So we sent them all back.
The book we've been talking about is called The 15, Murder, Retribution, and the Forgotten Story of Nazi POWs in America. William Geroux, our guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.